So I would like to thank all of our panelists, the presenters, and we would like to bring them back so that we would like to take some questions from the floor and engage in a discussion session with them. I do believe we have some questions. We have collected some questions from the online audiences. Let me first go through the question that we received on our YouTube channel, and this is going to Amy Shelver of UNTAD. The questioner is from Sim Jun Halls. And you've mentioned the importance of oral history and how it is linked with communication. Can you share us with more cases of oral history being used in communication? And our second question is also for Ms. Shelver. In the digital era, you've mentioned there are many different challenges, such as the spread of fake news. So we need to hone our critical thinking skills to overcome that. But how can cultural heritage help us to hone our critical thinking skills? Can you give us some case examples? This is something that we received from our YouTube channel as well.
And with regard to Mr. Lee Soo-sung's presentation, the question is that came in is the following. This is a question that was posted in English, so let me change my spectacles to read the questions. And I ask for your understanding. Please bear with me for just a moment. So, the question for Mr. Lee Soo-sung.
What sort of industries can be fostered in developing, least developed, and developed countries' issues based on ICH and how? 라는 질문을 해주셨습니다. 주로 이제 그 저개발국이나 개발.
So I can see that this question has to do with how the developing states or underdeveloped states find ways to craft ICH with industries or to develop new industries with ICH. Yes, so we have received a total of 3 questions via YouTube. And I would like to ask the respective speakers to respond if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to respond, I think, collectively, because the questions that were raised, I think, collide in the case of Sim Jun's question, and also the question about the digital era and creative thinking. So, critical thinking. Probably one of the best cases that I can provide actually comes from South Africa amid a deep crisis that we were experiencing through the 90s and early 2000s, and in fact all the way up to 2010, in the form of the HIV/AIDS crisis, where there was a lot of fake news going around that emanated from communities about how you contracted HIV. And how it was passed and where it was coming from scientifically. And in this case, a campaign to change people's minds and behaviors, drawing on oral history, case studies from people's history about how disease is transmitted, and then adapted to the HIV messaging, actually helped people not follow the fake news or the wrong information that HIV was being spread by small planes or by doctors themselves, to help people understand that actually this was a disease, and it was framed in the way of looking at other pandemics and other big crises that these communities had faced in the past. And so using that oral history, the message was able to be transformed from something that was negative or wrong into something that was positive. And this is just one case study of how, by tapping into existing stories that and histories and previous crises and experience of these events, people can leverage oral history, and now in the digital area also apply critical thinking or draw on their own histories to understand what is happening to us. And that is the key thing with all culture, is that with culture we make sense of our existence. And it can be used in a dark way, and it can be used in a light way, and that takes people with a cultural presence of mind to understand exactly what the essence and the truth of it is, and then to transmit that truth accurately to the people that are listening. I hope that answered your question and gave you a good enough concrete example of oral history in play, in communications, and in behavior change. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다, 셜버 씨.
Thank you very much for your response. So you've mentioned about HIV/AIDS in South Africa and all about how fake news had an impact through the oral culture of the past that has enabled an accurate communication of facts based on science. So thank you very much for that response. And next, Managing Director Lee Soo-sung, would you like to respond? Yes. So let me clarify the question once again. Let me see if I understood the question. So for underdeveloped states and for developing nations, how can these countries utilize ICH to create new industries? So that is, I believe that is the correct understanding of the question. So having said that, in order to build businesses or industries, there are certain requirements that have to be met. For instance, in the case of contents, and well, ICH includes many things, but it could be food culture, it could be contents, it can actually branch out to many areas. But for this to be commercialized or to make this into an industry, you need a foundation. So particularly, the cultural industries that we see right now do have a strong industrial base. And like in the many cases of advanced nations, and let's take the case of Korea in the 80s and 90s. And now in Korea, we're a cultural power, but because we had that industrial basis in place in the 80s and 90s, we are now able to enjoy the benefits of this very strong base. But as mentioned, that wasn't the case in the past when we did not have that foundation. So then for the underdeveloped and developing nations, what can be done is, as was mentioned by the panelists, so you can see that you're trying to archive and inventory the ICH and engage in safeguarding practices. So the first thing that you can do is to have, well, some of the advanced nations utilize their contents by taking advantage of the industrial foundation that they already have. So when I talk about industrialization of ICH, you need a domestic market, or you need a domestic industrial base to have that take off. But with countries with a less sophisticated industrial base, if you do have a strong contents industry already, then it wouldn't be much an issue. But if you do not have a strong domestic industry base in the country, in most cases, it's very difficult and challenging to actually turn these ICH into an industry right away. But as mentioned, it's all about a platform. So you can utilize the platform of other countries as an initial attempt. In the case of Netflix, They invested in the relevant local markets, and they're curating contents that caters to the needs of the local market. So this could be one way to industrialize ICH. So what I want to say is that if you do not have a strong industrial base domestically, it may be a bit difficult and challenging to actually make ICH into an industry right away. Yes, thank you. I truly hope that that answered the question. And I think that there is another question for Professor Marilena. I'll leave it that too.
This is a question from Dimal. Could you share us with some information regarding your information management system? I think that it will be useful to us all to hear about your information management system. I think in the interest of time, perhaps you might not have enough time to go into the details, but if you can share us with some more details about the information management system, like the ones that you've been putting into use in the PCI in France. If you can tell us about how the information was managed, what kind of system you use there, please.
Yes, and there have been many publications written around the technology involved in putting together this project. Obviously, there were many different technological platforms that we used. The main platform of the iTreasures was a Drupal platform. And on that, they combined and interconnected it with different other platforms which were developed in each research partner. I can send you further details about the technology. I was more involved in the social aspect and community work and building those partnerships with the local people through the training and further demonstration activities. But there are many publications which you can find and are available online, including a recent paper I wrote. If I may able to add two things on the oral history question, though, which is a very interesting area of work for me, and I think needs to be further combined and brought closer together with work on intangible heritage. And in my recent book, I wrote about two specific cases of oral history work and how they can be used in museum and heritage work through also new technologies, but in the context of museology, which was based at the Museum of London, the one with working with refugees and combating those stereotypical representations through oral history carried out by refugee communities and presented within the context of museums. And the second one, which again further details are also available online, is another case from Peru, the Lugar de la Memoria, which is an entire museum built around oral history, testimony, and personal kind of engagements with the conflict of Peru, and how this has helped reshape visions about the future, but also come to terms with the traumatic and very difficult past, and how oral history and reviving those skills and knowledges has helped towards reconciliation, and perhaps going back to the South African cases. So oral history is a very powerful tool, and I think we need to be working more in that area. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다.
Yes, thank you. We do have some more questions for Ms. Amy Shelver. There's another question.
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation to Ms. Shelver. And the question goes, what can we do to make ICH more attractive to younger generations to help them continue to safeguard ICH? So what can we do to make ICH more attractive to younger people?
If I may, this is probably where that third tier, the communications focus in our tools and our arsenal, is that critical, because currently marketing campaigns, communications campaigns are what generates a sense of coolness or accessibility. And our creative people, our artists that are working at the ground level on these topics, are the people that are generating campaigns for big design companies, for marketing and advertising companies. And so I think really if we can harness the creativity inherent in the young people that are delivering digital content and digital marketing, and convince them to focus on intangible cultural heritage and its elements, that will be a turnkey in the way that cultural intangible cultural heritage is perceived. Because right now our issue is always making the intangible tangible and meaningful to people, and there are incredible ways that we can do this. And maybe to come back down to the oral history example, we are speaking more than ever before. We are documenting ourselves. This conference is an exemplar of new approaches to digitalization and speaking and recording history, as the previous panelists have mentioned. And so truly it is about packaging, communicating more clearly, and focusing and encouraging young people and marketers to focus on the topic of intangible cultural heritage. And there is, I think the Netflix example is also a very good one, Mr. Susan, Mr. Lee, because yes, it is taking local content and projecting it back to local audiences, and content there, intangible cultural heritage, the stories that make up our practices and our behaviors come from people, and if they're reflected back at us, it does make it more accessible. This obviously requires campaigns, it requires investment, it requires policy, it requires government, NGO, and the creative industries themselves to recognize the value in intangible cultural heritage. And so it is on all of us to pick up the baton and look at this as a key and important factor in transmitting not only our past histories, but our current histories as they evolve. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that response. And Professor Marta Severo, you also have a question? So they thanked you for your wonderful presentation, and also it's that for underdeveloped nations, developing countries, they haven't been able to engage in any inventorying of their ICH, and there are also cases where they don't have many inscriptions to the UNESCO list. So can you maybe help them out? Any advice that you would like to offer to these countries that weren't able to engage in any inventorying of their assets or heritage?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that the example that I provide show that low-tech solution are a very key point today. We can have big projects like iTreasure that are useful to find a new solution, but for everyday inventory, we can really work with very low tech like MediaWeek, but also more basic. The solution, the main point is to combine, I didn't have the time, but is to combine face-to-face activity to online activity. All these examples I provide, there are focus group, there are workshops that are organized with people on field work to produce content for the wiki. So this is my recommendation is to don't focus on big portal in underdeveloped countries, but think of basic solution to connect face-to-face activities.
네, 아유, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. We have yet another question on the CHA channel and also through the ICHCAP Center. It's in the Korean language. Thank you to all of our presenters and the panelists, especially for the case studies. They were helpful. When we continue to preserve ICH going forward, I believe that it's very important for countries to engage together internationally. So what can countries do internationally to better preserve ICH elements? This is a common question to the presenters. It's not designating one person in particular. So maybe each of you can go around and give us your thoughts. What should countries do? What should international society do to try to preserve these various ICH elements?
말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Can you let us know?
분부터 하실까요?
Who would like to go first?
순서대로 하면
Maybe we will go
쉘버
in order of the presentation. So Dr. Shelver, or maybe we would go in reverse order. Professor Severo, would you like to go first?
생각이 있으신지 제안해 주실 걸.
It's a very huge question. So I think the only answer we can say is great to have this initiative like this forum where we can share experience and work together. I think for software ACH at international level, we need this. We need a forum for exchange experience. Is really find common solution and learn from mistake of others. I don't have a specific solution, but this is just my talk on this point.
네, 네, 아주 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
그 계획도 필요하겠지만 이렇게
We would need grand goals, but also these small seminars and discussions and forums would be helpful for us to try to, each of us, look for different solutions and share them among ourselves.
다음은 그러면
Next, we would like to hear from Professor Alevizatu.
Thank you very much for the question. And from personal experience and having engaged in different international fora around the world, I think that the international community is very active in the field of intangible heritage through the convention and through the different mechanisms driven by UNESCO. The work so internationally, and especially with conferences, and the international dialogue is quite active. What I think we lack, and I think I'm taking on from where Marta left, is the discussions on the ground and seeing what happens, at what the community, at the level of communities and grassroots research, what is happening at that level, and bring that into perspective and learn from each other, but starting from the bottom up and having these international discussions. Every country is different and faces different issues, different challenges, whether they are, as you said, the digital divide. So by having forums such as this and exchanging ideas and dialogues, we also learn from each other, but also adapt to local situations. So my opinion is that already there is a lot happening internationally and at the higher level of UNESCO, but we should be learning more about challenges and opportunities that are raised on the ground. I hope that makes sense and that covers the question.
예, 감사합니다. 이수성
Thank you very much for the response. Mr. Lee, would you like to add? Efforts to safeguard and preserve ICH and identify ICH is not something that can be done by a single person or a single party. I believe that all stakeholders need to engage in joint efforts. And in other words, we need consolidated efforts in order to reap fruit. Well, my presentation, the topic was how to turn ICH into an industry. In the process of identifying ICH and to safeguard ICH, well, you first need investments to do all that. And I can say that these investments are not just one-off. What happens is, so with the investments, we can identify and safeguard ICH. And once we do that, it also continues on to create new value. So there is this virtuous cycle, which induces new investments, creating another set of new values. So there is this virtual cycle that can come to play. So, of course, we do have public agencies or governments that need to push from behind and support, but the industries also have to engage in pull. There's a pulling effect that also has to be in place. So you've mentioned that with developed nations and developing nations, they would have to cooperate. And based on your comments, I can once again re-emphasize the importance of cooperation across the board amongst all countries.
Now, we would like to hear from Ms. Shelver, and with that, we would like to conclude.
I think my colleagues have covered everything, and I tend to agree with Professor Lee that we need to engage communities. And the critical part of my presentation was that we have three powerful C's in our arsenal. We have culture, we have creativity, and we have communication. And these three important intangible things in and of themselves can be a driving force for change, for awareness, and for maximizing intangible cultural heritage.
네, 오늘 그 토론 시간이 좀 짧은
We regret that we did not have enough time for the discussion. But due to time limits, I'm afraid that we have to close here our discussion session. I would like to thank our four panelists, Amy Shelver, Lee Soo-sung, Marilena Libizatu, and Marta Severo. Our panelists, thank you very much for your time and your presence here with us today. And of course, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all of our online audiences who are joining us through various different channels, both on YouTube and our official website, who have submitted their questions and opinions. Thank you to our online audiences. With that, we would like to conclude the first session of the 2021 World Forum for ICH.